Hello, everybody. My name is Steve Camacho, and this is a short presentation on the TCDSB yearly budget. Today, we're going to talk about a few topics. We're going to introduce how the budget is developed. We're going to describe what it means to have a balanced budget. We're going to look at what a typical budget for the TCDSB looks like. We'll describe our consultation plan, and finally, we'll talk about the next steps in the budget process. So how do we develop a budget at the TCDSB? The budget is developed in a yearly cycle. First, we start by gathering information about backgrounds and costs and revenues. So this describes what we get from the ministry in terms of revenues, what our costs might be for the year, and other background information that helps us plan for what the next year is going to look like. Once we've had that initial background information, we move to our consultation phase. We consult with stakeholders and try to get input from them on what they believe is important to next year's budget. We consult with parents, students, our union partners, and the general public as we build the budget for the next year. Once a consultation has been completed and the information has been compiled, at this point, we start to develop our draft budget. This process typically starts in April and leads into May. At this point, the ministry has also typically announced their funding for the following budget year. Based on the information from the ministry, our consultation plan, and the information gathered early in the process, we start to develop the draft budget to present to the Board of Trustees in May. In May, we bring the budget towards the draft budget to the Board of Trustees, and we seek input from the board and look at in terms of motions and other information that may be important to develop the budget. Then from that final input that we get from the Board of Trustees, we go back, we rejig the budget and bring it back forward in June for final approval. And then ultimately we submit it to the ministry by June 30th of the year. And this is for the starting of the next fiscal year, which starts in September. So what does it mean to have a balanced budget? For a budget to be balanced, we must, for a particular year, we must balance the revenue, the money we receive from government and various different places, and our expenses, the different expense areas where we spend the money that we receive. So typically on the revenue side, we have a number of buckets of different revenues. We have what we call our GSNs, which stands for Grants for Student Needs. These are the large grants that we get from the government. We have fees of various different sorts, whether that be student fees, activity fees, and so forth at the local school level. We have international student visa fees, so fees that we charge, tuition, if you will, that we charge for international students that are part of our system. And we have other fees, such as permit fees for renting other spaces or leasing fees and other things of that nature. We also have some other revenues from different places that tend to be a lot smaller, but these are sort of the big items on the revenue side. On the expense side, we have our instructional expense. So what does it take to run a school? Our teaching staff, vice principals, secretaries, and so forth. That's all the instructional expense. We have the expenses related to the maintenance of our buildings. That'd be school buildings, that'd be just maintaining them, utilities. We also have expenses for repairs and so forth. We also have governance and administration spend. So the spend we have to maintain the overall system and make system-wide decisions. And we have transportation costs, the cost to transport students to and from to school on the school bus. We also have a few other expense areas, but these are the big ones. Again, a balanced budget means these two sides of the equation are equal. We spend all that we can, we spend all that we're going to get from the government and other sources in the same fiscal and the same school year. Having a balanced budget is actually a legal requirement. As part of the Education Act, a board has to adopt estimates or a budget that doesn't show an in-year deficit, which means that the budget must be balanced. Having an in-year deficit would mean that we are planning to spend more money than we make, which again is not allowed. And also the other way around, if we can't have a planned surplus. If we have a planned surplus, that means we're planning to spend less money than we take in, which means that we would be underserving our students. It's also important to note that a balanced budget typically means we're not using reserves. So this is money that may have built up over years for various different reasons. And those reserves are typically used for one-time expenditures for, say, a particular project or something one-time of nature. Typically, a balanced budget means that our revenues and our expenses for that particular year are balanced, not including those special one-time items. So what does a typical budget look like for the TCDSB? If we were to break down all our costs, again, in a typical year, you would see something like this. 81% of our budget, our expenditures, goes to instruction. So that's teachers, that's ECEs, that's EAs, that's school office staff, everything it takes to run a school, and also those sort of central supports that run the school. So curriculum staff, anything that's going to support special education, things of those nature, all come from the instructional bucket. About 9% of our costs go towards buildings and maintenance. So that's what it takes to keep our buildings clean, keep our buildings safe, but also to maintain them and repair them. Things like new windows, doors, roofs, but also to maintain utilities, keep the power on, the lights, and so forth. About 3% of our budget goes towards student transportation, so the school bus, getting kids to and from school. About 3% of our budget goes to school-generated things. So this would be items that the schools would charge for, so field trips, activity fees, and so forth. This is typically matched to what they get on the other side. So about 3% of that money goes towards that. 2.5% goes to board governance and administration, so board of the trustees, senior staff, but also goes into other central services such as HR, IT, and a few other areas that are similar. And then about 1.5% goes into sort of other items, things like insurance and so forth. They don't fit neatly into one of these categories. School board also gets monies from for different initiatives. The two big ones are new schools, so capital, what we call capital development. New schools and additions comes from the government, and they typically get announced at various different points throughout the year. And they're project specific. So we'll get money for a particular school or a particular addition or a childcare addition, something to that effect. And they're funded on a project by project basis. We also get money for different special initiatives. So if the government had a particular initiative, for example, this past year we had a broadband initiative that funded some additional upgrades to internet services at our schools. Those come as separate one-time project items for special initiatives. So what happens after we've sort of developed that initial budget and those initial estimates? We also go through a few other activities before we get to the final budget in June. So we'll go through enrollment projections. That typically happens around the same time as we introduce the budget in March. Following that, we have a staffing projections to get a sense for what the staffing levels would be into next year based on how many students that we think are going to be in the school system in September. Throughout the process, we continue to collect information and plan for the following year. Again, as I've mentioned before, we have our stakeholder consultations. And then in April, we also typically get the ministry funding announcement for the following year. And again, based on that all information, we develop a draft budget in May, and then we have a final budget in June. Throughout the process, as we mentioned before, consultation is key. So every year we go through a very robust consultation plan, and this year is no different. So we have surveys for both parents, students, and the general public, as well as for CSPC chairs to work with their local CSPCs to collect information. We have virtual town halls. We typically have 1 to 3 virtual town halls every year, so we can present some information and collect some feedback. We have our budget consultation website, which is www.tcdsb.org/budgetconsult, where we've been posting all the information regarding the budget process and all the relevant documents that have been presented to the Board of Trustees. And finally, throughout the process, we have a number of opportunities in the boardroom to discuss the budget, both with trustees, as well as opportunities for members of the public to delegate to the Board of Trustees on what they believe is important for the budget into the next year. So that's how we develop our budget, and thank you very much for listening.